Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Tuned in to The Killer Tea, a podcast hosted by two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of The Killer Tea. On today's episode, we will be discussing Michael Madison, the East Cleveland Killer.
We are your hosts, Chelsea
and Christina.
And we're back on our bullshit.
So this episode will probably be another 30-minute one, but this is our hometown killer.
Yes.
Probably one of the newer killers. Well, there was Anthony Sowell.
But he was early 2000s. Israel Keys was early 2000s. And this guy was like 2015 when he was caught.
Yeah. So often we are covering people from like the 1930s to the 1970s. When serial killers just,
was the golden age.
The golden age of serial killers, really. I don't know what was going on in the 70s, man. But
I do. Lots of acid. And lead paint.
Unfettered access to murder, Chelsea.
Michael Madison was born on October 15th, 1977, to his mother, Diane Madison. Now, Diane was a single mother, and although she reported that Michael's father was John Baldwin, John denies ever knowing Diane and claims that he had absolutely no part in Michael's childhood. Diane was ill-equipped to raise Michael. This woman should probably never have had any children.
Correct.
She was also raised in a single-parent household by her mother, who had left Diane's father when she was very young. And Diane's mother eventually became a heroin addict and turned into prostitution to provide for her. Diane really didn't do much better with her own son, Michael. She never permitted Michael to have other children over for playdates during his early years. They didn't celebrate any holidays. And so most of Michael's early relationships were pretty limited to his mother and whatever boyfriend she had at the time, who were not really the best people either and often abused both Michael and Diane.
Michael Madison did an interview with another podcast host pretty recently, and the podcast host right off the cuff asked him what his childhood was like. Was he sexually abused? Was he physically abused? And Michael's response was very much so, it was not an ideal childhood, but he didn't realize how bad it was until he was much older and had some sort of basis of comparison. Now, granted, we all know that abuse does not equate to serial killer.
But it is a theme.
Yeah, that is definitely a theme. But
very rarely do we encounter a serial killer who had this idyllic childhood.
He described his childhood as complicated at best. He said he had nothing great to really say about his upbringing, that he didn't have any strong relationship, no ties to anyone, and that nothing really was very good. All he knew was his mother and different men circulating in and out of his life, and he never looked at any of them as a father figure or even really as an authority figure. He described his mother's parenting more like bullying. She worked to tear him down when he got too big to physically discipline, and he said that was actually worse for him than the physical discipline, because every ounce of self-esteem and confidence that he had, she would find a way to remove from him.
Right. In 1980, when Michael was just 3 years old, Child and Family Services were called on Diane for the first time, and it was discovered that she had forced food down Michael's throat to the point where it made him vomit. She put him into a tub of extremely hot water, and when he screamed from the pain, she beat him with an extension cord. Later that same year, they were called out to the home again after Michael was treated at Mount Sinai Hospital for an injury to his forehead and severe bruising. Here's another case of child services not removing children when they should legitimately be removed.
From a very dangerous situation. I feel like my brain always wants to go, how to not make a serial killer. Even though I know that at the end of the day, sometimes they just exist.
Yeah.
I wonder how preventable is unaliving people.
Yeah. That's a deep discussion for another episode, I think.
The pattern of abuse continued with Michael being hospitalized again 6 months later after one of Diane's boyfriends beat Michael so bad he ended up losing hearing in one ear when he was 4 years old.
Wow.
Social workers assigned to his case reported that he had suffered contusions, abrasions, and swelling on the shaft of his penis. Michael was removed from his mother's custody but placed with his grandmother, who was a heroin addict and a prostitute. Diane received counseling, and after a short time, he was returned to her custody, but the abuse did not stop. He was hospitalized in 1982 with severe dehydration, and in 1983, social workers were still reporting bruising and scratching on Michael.
So why was he still allowed to be in his mother's care? This just, again and again, social workers are being called to this house, and he's still put right back with her. And I know that the number one goal of the foster care system is reunification. And I'm on board with helping parents learn how to become better parents and reuniting families. I get that that's the number one goal of foster care.
But shouldn't abuse be categorized something different? It's not as if the ignorance of not knowing how to properly manage a child or raise a child, the actual torture. It's torture.
I could see, like, one time she's beat him and they come out and they're like, whoa, parenting classes, counseling, and she gets the help she needs and they move forward and that physical abuse doesn't happen again, then great. We've unified the family again, and that's ultimately the goal. But again and again and again, she is showing that she cannot be trusted to take care of her child.
He, in this interview that he had with another podcaster, said he thinks he just would have been better off in foster care.
He probably would have been better off in foster care.
From his perspective, in terms of the abuse that he endured as a child, at least with neglect, he wouldn't have been physically abused. So he, in his mind, if he went into the foster care system and was more or less ignored, he at least wouldn't have had the bullying and the mental abuse and the physical abuse from his mother. Michael does not remember much from his early years of abuse, but he does recall being trapped in a long room with one of Diane's boyfriends. Specialists suggest that this could have been a coping mechanism that Michael developed to disassociate from what was happening to him. As Michael grew up, he developed hatred towards women, and he would regularly lash out at any female authority figure. A quote from a former girlfriend of Michael's said, he would frequently say that he hated the female species.
So if he's disassociating, I wonder if there was sexual abuse there. I wonder if his mom was using him to get whatever it was she wanted from these men in her life.
I know the common thing on TikTok now is to say, I was disassociating, and blah, blah,
but
blah,
it
blah,
really
blah.
is.
But it is a clinical thing.
It is a way that your brain protects you from trauma.
When you were in school for psychology, did you have to take any sort of classes on childhood abuse? For what your emphasis was in, was there much conversation on pediatric abuse?
No, not really. It was more generalized. Psychology is such a specific field, and there are so many specialities within psychology. It would be impossible to have a really firm knowledge in every single little aspect, depending on if you're going to be a counselor, or depending on if you're going to be a social worker, or depending on if you're going to be a therapist. There's just so many different variables, and then you have the differentiation between a psychiatrist versus a psychologist.
So, okay, that being said, do you know when it comes to the social workers, is that a special qualification that you have to get?
Oh yeah, most social workers require a master's degree.
So these people have master's degrees that all circulate around a niched down subject like child abuse.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. It's easy to say the social workers aren't doing shit, but a lot of the time the social workers' hands are tied.
lack of resources.
They can only do so much with the resources that they are given. And the judicial system is like, no, and fails them. Or there's protocols, like you can't just take a child away. You have to meet XYZ requirements. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't shitty social workers. There absolutely are shitty social workers.
The Gabriel Hernandez case,
that
do you
case
agree
was-
with prosecuting the social workers?
Yeah, because I think the social workers failed him.
By 16 years old, Michael was a nomad. He left Diane's house and was sleeping anywhere that he could. He got his first official police-recorded incident at 17 years old, where he was charged with delinquency for inappropriately touching a classmate. Then at 20, he was jailed for drug abuse, to which he served an undisclosed amount of time in jail, but he must have been released quickly because a few short years later, he was convicted of rape for assaulting an 18-year-old girl. He served 4 years for this conviction and had to register as a sex offender. And when asked about this, he very flippantly says, tomato, tomato, it was attempted rape. Yikes.
So many red flags. He very clearly has mommy issues and has
lack of empathy,
lack
of
hatred
sympathy,
towards women. Just gross. On July 19th, 2013, police were dispatched to a call of a foul odor coming from a garage that was leased to Michael Madison. Upon arrival, they discovered the decomposing remains of a female victim. The next day, 2 more bodies were discovered. One was located in a grass field and the other in an abandoned house. Both locations were within 200 yards of the garage that Madison was leasing. And when police went to Madison's apartment, they also discovered signs of decomposition within his apartment, so they issued a warrant for his arrest.
How can people live with the smell? So many serial killers can live
With the smell?
with the smell of decomp.
Is it one of those things where like you're surrounded by it so frequently that you don't notice it? But I would think a decomposing body, like the flies and the bugs, and I mean,
Filth. You'd be living in filth, absolute filth. On July 22nd, police located Madison, who was hiding out at his mother's house. After a short standoff, he was apprehended.
The bodies were shortly identified to be 3 women who had been reported missing. The first victim found in the garage was identified as Sherelda Terry. She was 18 years old and had been reported missing on July 10, 2013, after she never returned home after her summer job at the Cleveland Elementary School. The second victim, which was located in the grass field, was identified as Shatisha Sheely. She was 28 years old and had been reported missing since September of 2012. And the final victim was identified as Angela Deskins. She was 38 years old and had been missing since June of 2013. These women were all reported missing in a fairly short amount of time. I mean, Angela was in June of 2013 and Sherelda was July 10th of 2013. Shatisha, September 2012.
The coroner was able to identify that the women had only been killed within 6 to 10 days before they were discovered, which means that at least for Shatisha and Angela, they had been kidnapped and held long before being murdered by Madison. Not much has been released about the case, but they did report that all 3 women were strangled and then folded and put into garbage bags before he disposed of them. During the police interrogation, Madison was quoted as saying he idolized Anthony Sowell, another Cleveland native that preyed on women who was caught in 2011.
And if you don't remember much about Anthony Sowell,
He was diabolical.
I highly suggest you go back to season 2 and listen to our episode on him. We go into a lot of detail about
They had
thoughts
very
on
similar
women.
abuse stories, actually.
They do.
Remember Anthony Sowell's mom beat him with a phone cord or the vacuum cord? I can't remember.
I think it was the vacuum cord, but they had very similar histories of abuse and trauma and
lived very close to each other. They didn't know each other, though. They didn't know each other.
No, but it is just interesting that they were raised in the same city in similar fashions.
This could be considered a copycat case because Sowell was caught in 2011 and Madison started ramping up his crimes in 2012. He went from rape and abuse to murder. A year after Sowell was highly publicized in the area. And
yeah, it's not unlikely that he heard all about the case and then decided that publicity was worth it. I don't know.
I kind of think that he was like, oh, hey, this guy got to do XYZ with these women, so I'm going to do that too. Because he held them captive. And
yeah, that's true. Castro was arrested shortly after Michael Madison, and he had those 3 girls, which who knows if he would have eventually murdered them.
What the fuck is going on with Cleveland, man? Michael Madison's trial was grossly overshadowed by the Ariel Castro case that broke open shortly after he was arrested, but in no way hindered the convictions that he received. Prosecutors brought down the harshest sentence possible for Madison. The 14-count indictment carried 6 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts for each victim, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapon possession by an ex-convict.
The 1 count of rape is interesting to me.
Maybe that's the only one that they could forensically prove.
Maybe. Prosecution sought the death penalty for Madison, and when the trial ended, the jury took only 1 day to convict Madison as guilty on all charges, as they should have.
Swift justice. During his sentencing, Madison was smirking and smiling, which caused Van Terry, the father of Sherelda Terry, to lunge at Madison in the courtroom. Terry was not charged with anything after his attempt, and Madison was sentenced to death on June 2nd, 2016. He is still currently sitting on death row and continues to try and overturn his sentence.
Now that video,
you can find it on YouTube, by the way.
It circulated pretty far around.
And I did not realize that was this case until we decided to cover this case, and I watched it. I had seen it on compilation videos so many times before this.
For sure.
But, oh my God, it is heart-wrenching because you can literally hear the dad talking about trying to find it within himself to forgive this clown, as he says.
Right.
And he looks back at Madison, and Madison smirks. Dad loses it. And, like, football league lunges towards Madison, and they're able to separate the two. But even as they're separating the dad, you can see his face. He's just riddled with fucking grief. It's awful.
It was really, really sad.
But luckily, no, he didn't get charged with anything. Because unfortunately, in those situations,
I mean, they could have charged him. Would it have been right? Well, no. But
it probably would have been, the public would have been an outcry of rage had they done that.
Sherelda Terry, again, was only 18 years old.
She's a baby.
And she was described as a good girl. She often attended Bible study and worked at the Cleveland Elementary School over the summer. She was described by her grandmother as a hugger, and they often told her they were going to put her on a hug diet.
Shatisha Sheely was 28 years young. She lived on the edge, as was quoted from the court-appointed attorney. Shatisha did not have the easiest life. She lived in an apartment alone with no family around to help her. Unfortunately, not much else is known about her.
Angela Deskins, who was 38 years old, she was known as a very trusting person with an extremely supportive family. We have kind of a combination here. When we see women going missing, they normally are more in Shatisha's circumstances, which is very sad. They don't have anyone there to kind of help, but
it kind of sounds like he was more of an opportunistic.
He must have just saw the opportunity to grab these women
as long as they were young enough. And Angela was 38, so she was the oldest. So sad.
Life's wasted.
So ridiculous that we're past the aughts and we're still having serial killers picking women up off the street and take advantage of them.
Ridiculous.
There is actually more to this story in a bizarre way.
Interesting turn of events, right? So he was picked up in 2013. Right? 6 years later, on June 22nd, 2019, Jalen Plummer, who is actually Michael's cousin, entered the home of Diane Madison, who you will remember is Michael's mother, and began stabbing the 2 10-year-old girls who were later identified as Plummer's sister and cousin. And then he also started stabbing his 12-year-old brother. But the 12-year-old managed to escape and call the police. But during that time, Jalen Plummer ended up stabbing to death Diane Madison. And she was only 62 years old, and she ended up passing. Now, the 3 kids did manage to survive. I just think it's really interesting that only 6 years later, his cousin kills his
and
mom.
was going to commit more murders. The attorney tried to blame it on the 18-year-old smoking weed and said it was laced with PCP.
No,
I don't buy it.
I don't buy that either.
And also, they said there was no evidence that there was PCP in his bloodstream.
I do think this is interesting, though, because we know about Michael's upbringing and his childhood. And there's a quote in this news article, WKYC3 Studios, about Madison. And it said she was someone who was compassionate, who cared about her family, who cared about her grandkids, who cared about her kids, even when they couldn't reciprocate, maybe. Ken Wood, a friend of Diane Madison who worked with her at the Western Reserve Land Conservancy, said. Which is really interesting considering we know how Michael was raised.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's also outward appearances.
I know.
It's so hard because people wear all kinds of different faces.
That's very true. I do think it's interesting to note that Michael Madison has been trying to overturn his conviction this whole time. And it went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. And the Ohio Supreme Court was like, fuck you.
Yeah, no, that's ridiculous. It's
still
crazy to me.
You still get the death sentence. You're a piece of shit.
Obviously, he's not an intimate partner, but I'm looking for information, and I just found that the regions with the largest number of females killed purely by intimate partners, not including other family members, were Asia, Africa, and America.
Icky.
42% of the murders of women and girls is done by perpetrators outside of the family. That's still way too close to it being 50-50 in my opinion. You would think that it would be 90% strangers and 10%. But no. We have a very long episode coming up next that may potentially need to be split into 2.
We'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. You might get lucky and we might just give you a big ass long episode since the past couple have been kind of short.
Yes.
However, we don't know yet, so you don't know yet. We kind of just wing it here. We wing our life, we wing our eyeliner.
Just winging everything.
And our sanity.
Well, also, another thank you to Tara. Because
yes, Tara. Thank you once again.
Without Tara, this episode would not be happening.
Yes, Tara has been amazing. We will bring her on again sometime soon to do an episode.
Maybe for our season finale.
Maybe for the season finale. We already know who our season finale is going to be, and it is one of our shared interests amongst the 3 of us. So.
Yes, he's very interesting.
I know we have a while to go before we get there, but just so excited. All right, guys. Until next time.
Bye. Join us in our next episode where we discuss Fred and Rosemary West,
the Gloucester House of Horrors.
You call it trauma. I call it spicy memory.